Have you ever wondered what happens when life takes away your childhood? Enter the world of Emily Carter, a girl raised in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, where the love of family mixes with unspoken burdens. From cold basements to stolen dreams, she struggles to find herself amid a spiral of responsibility and sacrifice. Can Emily break free and build a life of her own? Listen to this story, a journey of tears, strength, and triumph that promises to keep you glued to your seat. My name is Emily Carter, and I grew up in a small town just outside Calgary, Alberta. Life used to feel simple, with the Rocky Mountains in the distance and cold winters that kept us all close. I was 6 when my little sister Sophie came along. At first, I was thrilled. I'd dreamed of being a big sister, imagining us playing in the snow or building forts in the backyard. But that dream didn't last long. Sophie wasn't like other kids. She was diagnosed with severe autism, and from the moment she arrived, everything I knew about my family flipped upside down. It started small. My parents, Mark and Lisa, were always busy with Sophie. I'd try to show them a drawing I'd made at school, but they'd be too focused on her tantrums or her therapy schedule to notice. Then came the big shift. One night, Dad sat me down and said they needed my room. Sophie had to be closer to them because she'd wake up screaming, and they couldn't keep running up and down the stairs. So, at 6 years old, I was moved to the basement. It wasn't some cozy finished space either, just a cold concrete room with a flickering light bulb and a mattress on the floor. I'd lie there at night, shivering under my blankets, listening to the muffled sounds of my family upstairs. It felt like I'd been erased. The toys were next. I'd saved up my allowance to buy a little toy horse set. I loved plastic figures I'd play with for hours. Sophie didn't mean to break them, but she did. She'd fling them across the room or chew on them until they snapped. I'd run to Mom, tears streaming down my face, begging her to do something. "She's little, Emily," she'd say, brushing me off. "You're the big sister. You need to understand." Understand? I was a kid too, but no one seemed to care. My toys kept disappearing, and soon I stopped asking for new ones. What was the point? Years passed, and the weight of it all grew heavier. By the time I was 14, I'd gotten a laptop from school, a reward for good grades. It was the first thing I'd had that felt truly mine. I'd spend hours on it, doing homework, or chatting with my friend Jake from down the street. Then one day, I came home from school to find it smashed. Sophie had gotten hold of it while I was out. The screen was cracked, the keys scattered across the floor. I screamed at my parents, expecting them to back me up. Instead, Dad sighed and said, "You should have locked it up, Emily. You know how she is." The school called me irresponsible. My parents didn't even blink. I was alone in that mess, and it wasn't just about a laptop, it was about feeling like no one had my back. Being Sophie's sister wasn't just tough, it was suffocating. I loved her deep down, but my life wasn't mine anymore. If I was studying, I'd have to stop to calm her down. If I was with friends, my phone would buzz with texts from Mom. "Come home! We need you!" I couldn't even breathe without checking if Sophie was okay. My parents didn't see me as their daughter, they saw me as her keeper. I'd watch other kids at school, laughing and planning hangouts, while I was stuck on call 24/7. Waiting for the next crisis. One day, I decided I'd had enough. Jake had been raving about the new Spider-Man movie coming out, and I wanted in. It had been forever since I'd done something just for me. So I made a plan. 2 hours at the theater, phone off, no guilt. I told Mom I'd be out for a bit, and she nodded absent-mindedly. Walking into that theater with Jake, I felt free like a normal teenager for once. The movie was amazing, and for those 2 hours, I forgot everything. But when I turned my phone back on, reality crashed in. 20 missed calls, texts screaming, "Where are you?" I called home, heart pounding. Mom picked up, her voice sharp as a blade. "Sophie had a meltdown an hour ago, and you weren't here." "Where were you?" I stammered, trying to explain, but she cut me off. "Get home, now!" I raced back, the joy from the movie gone. When I walked in, the house was chaos, Sophie wailing, Mom yelling, Dad glaring at me like I'd committed a crime. "A movie?" Dad snapped. We rely on you, Emily, and you vanish for some stupid movie? I tried to tell them I just needed a break, but Mom shut me down. Your responsibilities are here. That's what matters. They grounded me for a month. A month trapped in that basement, punished for wanting 2 hours to myself. That night, I sat on my bed, staring at the damp walls, and something broke inside me. I wasn't a kid to them, I was a tool. Things got worse after that. At 18, I was supposed to be thinking about my future, but it felt like I didn't have one. One evening, I was talking to Dad about college's University of Alberta, maybe even UBC. For once, it was about me. I was excited, flipping through brochures, dreaming of a life beyond Calgary. Then Dad chuckled and said, "Pick something good, eh? You'll need the cash to take care of Sophie when we're gone." He laughed like it was a joke, but it wasn't funny. It was a punch to the gut. All my anger, all my pain, erupted. I screamed at him, tears streaming down my face. My whole life's about her. I'm not her slave. I told him how I'd lost my childhood, my toys, my freedom, everything to her needs. Mom just stared, cold and silent. Dad's face hardened. "You're selfish," he said. That was it. I ran to the basement, slammed the door, and collapsed on the floor, sobbing. Hours passed. They didn't come check on me. Not a knock, not a word. I was invisible again. The silence stretched into days. I couldn't take it anymore. I needed out. I thought of my grandpa, Jack, who lived up in Red Deer. He'd always been the one person who listened. Late one night, I stuffed a backpack with clothes, my school stuff, and a photo of me and Sophie from when we were little. I texted Grandpa, "Can I come stay?" His reply was instant. "Doors open, kid." I left without a note, slipping out into the snowy night. The bus ride to Red Deer was quiet, the world outside a blur of white. When I got to Grandpa's little house, he didn't ask questions, just pulled me into a hug and handed me a mug of hot chocolate. Living with Grandpa was like breathing fresh air after years underwater. He didn't push me to talk, but when I did, he listened. I told him everything, the basement, the laptop, the movie, Dad's joke. His face darkened with every word. "They've got no right putting this on you," he growled. "Sophie's supposed to have a caregiver. A real one, not you, a Rose." "A caregiver?" Grandpa's voice shook as he told me the truth. My parents had been telling the family they'd hired help for Sophie, even taking money from relatives to pay for it. But there was no caregiver. It had been me all along. Grandpa was furious. "They lied to us all," he said, pacing the room. "This ends now." Word spread fast. My Aunt Sarah called from Edmonton, horrified. Uncle Tom drove down from Grand Prairie, swearing he'd never have sent money if he'd known. Cousins texted, asking if I was okay. The family was in an uproar, piecing together years of my parents' lies. Grandpa took charge, telling me not to talk to Mom or Dad without him there. "I'll handle them first," he promised. For the first time, I felt protected. Saturday night, we met my parents at a diner in Calgary. I'd hoped for a fix, a way forward. Instead, it was a disaster. Grandpa sat beside me, his presence steady. But my parents were ice cold. They admitted it all, no caregiver, pocketing the money, leaving me to carry the load. But no apologies. Dad leaned forward, eyes hard, and said, "You were born to look after her, Emily. That's your job." My stomach dropped. Grandpa slammed his hand on the table. "She's not a servant," he roared. I couldn't hold it in, I yelled back, spilling every hurt, every lie they'd told. They didn't flinch. Mom just said, "You're overreacting." By the end, I was shaking, Grandpa's arm around me as we walked out. Any hope I'd had was ashes. That night, I made my choice. I wasn't going back. Grandpa and Uncle Tom sat with me, talking it through. "You're staying with me," Grandma said, firm. "And college out of Alberta. Start fresh." Aunt Sarah chimed in. She'd been sending money to Dad for Sophie's care. Now she'd send it to me for my future. My parents called once, not to apologize, but to ask when I'd come home. I didn't answer. The next day, I moved out for good. Grandpa and Uncle Tom helped me pack clothes, books, my birth certificate, all the pieces of me I could carry. Mom watched from the kitchen, silent, as Dad took Sophie out. As we loaded the truck, Mom broke. She grabbed me, sobbing, "I love you, Emily. I'll miss you." I hugged her back, tears stinging my eyes, and whispered goodbye. It hurt, but I had to go. Now sitting in my room at Grandpa's, I keep replaying that moment. Did she mean it? I want to believe her, but it's hard. I'm scared of this new life, scared of losing them for good. But I'm also free. I don't hate Sophie, she didn't choose this. I love her, and maybe one day I'll find a way to show it. For now, I'm figuring out who I am, away from the chaos. College is on the horizon, somewhere far from here, and for the first time, it's my choice. Grandpa's pushing me to be a kid again, movies with Jake, dinners with the family, no guilt. Aunt Sarah's money's building a fund, and the family's rallying around me. It's overwhelming, but it's mine. I'm not just Sophie's sister anymore. I'm Emily, and that's enough. Settling into Grandpa Jack's house in Red Deer felt like stepping into a new world. The first few weeks were a whirlwind of quiet moments and small victories. I'd wake up to the smell of bacon frying in the kitchen, Grandpa humming some old tune while he cooked. We'd sit at his rickety wooden table, eating breakfast together, and he'd ask me about my day, no rush, no demands, just curiosity. It was strange at first, having someone care about my plans without tying them to someone else's needs, but it grew on me, like the warmth of the sun after a long Alberta winter. School became my focus. I was still finishing my last year of high school, and for once, I could actually concentrate. No interruptions, no emergencies pulling me away. My grades had always been decent, but now they climbed higher. My teachers noticed Mrs. Henderson, my English teacher, even pulled me aside one day. "Emily, you've got a real shot at scholarships," she said, her eyes bright. "Where are you thinking for college?" I hadn't dared dream too big before, but now I started researching schools UBC in Vancouver, maybe even Dalhousie out in Nova Scotia. The idea of crossing provinces, starting somewhere totally new, lit a fire in me. Jake came up to visit one weekend, piling into Grandpa's truck with a bag of snacks and his usual goofy grin. We drove out to Sylvan Lake, just the two of us, and spent the day skipping rocks across the water, talking about everything and nothing. He'd heard the whole story by now, bits and pieces over texts, then the full version when I'd spilled it all one night on the phone. "You're tougher than you think, Em," he said, tossing a stone that skimmed the surface 5 times. Most people would have cracked way sooner. I laughed, but his words stuck with me. Maybe he was right. Maybe I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for. Grandpa kept pushing me to reclaim my life, bit by bit. One evening, he handed me a flyer for a local art class. Nothing fancy, just a community thing at the rec center. "You used to love drawing," he said, tapping the paper. "Give it a go." I hesitated, but he wouldn't let it drop, so I signed up. The first class was awkward me, and a bunch of retirees fumbling with pencils and sketch pads, but by the third, I was hooked. I'd forgotten how it felt to lose myself in something, to create without worrying it'd be taken away. My sketches weren't perfect, but they were mine, and that was enough. The family support didn't stop either. Aunt Sarah drove down from Edmonton one weekend, bringing a stack of college applications and a homemade lasagna. "We're in this together," she said, squeezing my shoulder. Uncle Tom sent me a beat-up guitar he'd found at a garage sale, with a note. "Learn a few chords. It'll drive Jack nuts." I laughed and started messing around with it, the twangy notes filling Grandpa's quiet house. Even my cousins got in on it, texting me dumb memes or calling to check in. It was like they were building a net around me, catching me every time I started to doubt myself. But my parents lingered in the back of my mind. They'd call every few days, not often, but enough to keep the wound fresh. The conversations were short, clipped. "How's school?" Mom would ask, her voice tight. "Fine," I'd say, not giving much. Dad tried once to bring up Sophie, saying she missed me, but I cut him off. "I can't talk about that yet," I said, and hung up. Grandpa watched me after those calls, his jaw tight, but he didn't push. "They'll figure out they're wrong eventually," he'd say. "Or they won't. Either way, you're not theirs to guilt anymore." One night, everything shifted. I was in my room, strumming the guitar, when Grandpa knocked on the door. His face was grim, not the usual easy smile I'd gotten used to. "Phone for you," he said, holding out his old cordless. "It's Sarah." I took it, confused Aunt Sarah usually texted. Her voice crackled through the line, urgent. "Emily, you need to hear this. Your parents, they're in trouble, big trouble." My stomach dropped. She explained. Someone had tipped off the authorities about the money they'd taken from the family, claiming it was for Sophie's care. An investigation had started fraud, maybe even neglect charges. The family was reeling, but no one was bailing them out this time. I sat there, stunned, the guitar slipping from my lap. Part of me wanted to feel sorry for them, but another part, the part that had been buried under years of their expectations, felt a cold, sharp relief. "What happens now?" I asked Sarah. "Court, probably," she said. "They're on their own. Jack's already said you're not getting dragged into it." I nodded, even though she couldn't see me, and handed the phone back to Grandpa. He sat beside me, quiet for a long time. "You okay, kid?" he finally asked. "I don't know," I admitted, "but I think I will be." The news spread fast. By the next week, it was all anyone at school could talk about: whispers in the halls, stares in the cafeteria. Jake stuck close, glaring at anyone who got too nosy. "They don't know squat," he muttered, shoving a fry in his mouth at lunch. I appreciated it, but the attention was suffocating. I threw myself into my art and my college apps, trying to block it out. Mrs. Henderson helped, letting me stay late in her classroom to work on essays. "You've got a story worth telling," she said once, reading over my UBC application. "Don't let this mess define it." Months rolled by, and spring hit Red Deer with a burst of green. The investigation dragged on, but I kept my distance. Grandpa got updates from Sarah, court dates, lawyers, the works, but he filtered it, only telling me what I needed to know. My parents stopped calling. I didn't know if it was shame or anger, and I didn't ask. Sophie was with them, and Sarah said social services was stepping in to make sure she got real care this time. It stung, knowing I couldn't see her, but it also felt right. She deserved better than what we'd all been stuck with. Graduation came in June, a sunny day with a breeze rolling off the prairies. I walked across the stage, diploma in hand, and spotted Grandpa in the crowd, clapping louder than anyone. Jake whooped from the back, earning a glare from the principal. Afterward, we celebrated at Grandpa's pizza, music. The whole family crammed into his tiny living room. Aunt Sarah handed me an envelope. The first chunk of my college fund, wired straight to me. "Vancouver's waiting," she said with a wink. I hugged her tight, the weight of the last year melting away. That summer, I worked part-time at a coffee shop in town, saving every penny for UBC. I'd gotten in full ride, thanks to Mrs. Henderson's recommendation, and a killer essay about resilience. Jake and I hung out when we could, biking around Red Deer or sneaking into late-night movies. Grandpa taught me to fish at the lake, laughing when I hooked his hat instead of a trout. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine, a life I was building piece by piece. The day I left for Vancouver was bittersweet. Grandpa drove me to the airport in Calgary, the truck rattling the whole way. He hugged me at the gate, his voice rough. "You're gonna do big things, Emily. Don't look back unless you want to." I nodded, tears prickling my eyes, and boarded the plane. As it took off, I watched Alberta shrink below me, Calgary, Red Deer, all of it fading into the distance. My parents were still there, tangled in their mess, but I wasn't. Not anymore. I was heading west, toward a future I'd fought for, and for the first time, I felt light, free, ready. The plane touched down in Vancouver, and as I stepped off into the bustling airport, the salty tang of the Pacific air hit me. It was different from the crisp, dry breeze of Alberta, wetter, wilder, alive in a way I hadn't expected. I hauled my suitcase through the terminal, nerves buzzing under my skin. UBC was waiting, and with it, a life I'd barely dared to imagine. Grandpa had slipped a crumpled 20 into my hand back at the airport, muttering, "For a coffee or something. Don't spend it all at once." I smiled at the memory, clutching it in my pocket as I flagged a cab to campus. My dorm was a squat brick building overlooking a sprawl of green lawns and towering cedars. My roommate, Priya, was already there when I arrived short, with a quick laugh and a mess of dark curls. She was from Victoria, studying biology, and within 10 minutes of meeting, she dragged me out to explore. We wandered through the campus, past lecture halls and food trucks, her chatter filling the silence I'd carried from Red Deer. "You're quiet," she said, nudging me as we grabbed burgers from a stand. "Just taking it all in," I replied, and she grinned. "You'll fit right in. This place is nuts, but it's home." Classes started the next week, and I threw myself into them. English Lit, psychology, a random elective on film studies. I loved it all. The profs didn't care where I'd come from or what I'd been through. They just wanted my ideas. I'd sit in the back of the lecture hall, scribbling notes, feeling the thrill of being there for me, not someone else. Priya and I studied together most nights, sprawled across our dorm floor with textbooks and cheap coffee. She'd tease me about my Alberta accent. "You say A, way too much, M." But it was easy with her, like I'd found a friend without even trying. Vancouver itself was a shock. The city hummed with energy, rain-slick streets, ferries cutting through the harbor, mountains looming on the horizon. I'd walk down Granville Street on weekends, dodging crowds and street musicians, or take the bus to Wreck Beach just to watch the waves crash. It was loud and chaotic, but I craved it. Every step felt like proof I'd made it out. I'd call Grandpa once a week, filling him in on the little stuff: how I'd aced a paper, how Priya burned popcorn in the microwave. He'd laugh, his voice crackling through the line. "Sounds like you're living, kid. Keep it up." But the past wasn't gone. One rainy afternoon, I was in the library when my phone buzzed a text from Aunt Sarah. "Court's done. They got probation, fines. Sophie's with a foster family now." I stared at the screen, the words blurring. Probation meant they weren't in jail, but Sophie being gone from them hit harder. I texted back, asking if she was okay. "She's good," Sarah replied. "Real caregivers this time. They're making sure." I leaned back in my chair, relief mixing with a dull ache. I hadn't seen Sophie in months, and the distance hurt. But knowing she was safe softened it. The first semester flew by, and I went back to Red Deer for Christmas. Grandpa picked me up from the Calgary airport, his truck idling in the snowy lot. The drive to his place was quiet, the prairies stretching out under a gray sky. When we got home, the house was warm, a fire snapping in the living room. Aunt Sarah and Uncle Tom were there, along with a pile of presents and a turkey roasting in the oven. It was the first holiday I'd had without tension hanging over me. We ate, laughed, played cards late into the night. Grandpa even pulled out his old harmonica, butchering jingle bells until we were all in stitches. I caught myself thinking, this is what family's supposed to feel like. Back at UBC, second semester brought new challenges. I joined a writing club, spurred by my film studies prof, who'd liked a short story I'd turned in. The group met in a cramped basement room, a mix of artsy types and nervous freshmen like me. I'd read my pieces aloud, voice shaky at first, but they listened, really listened. One guy, Liam, a lanky kid with glasses and a dry sense of humor, started sitting next to me. We'd critique each other's work, then grab coffee after, talking about books and movies until the sky darkened. He was from Kelowna, easygoing in a way that balanced my edges. "You've got a knack for tension," he said once, sipping his latte. "Your stories pull you in." I shrugged, but inside, I glowed. Summer rolled around, and I stayed in Vancouver. I'd landed a job at a bookstore near campus, shelving novels and ringing up customers. The pay was decent, and it kept my college fund growing. Priya stuck around too, working at a lab, and we'd meet up after shifts to explore the city Stanley Park picnics, late-night ramen runs. Liam tagged along sometimes, his quiet jokes cutting through Priya's endless energy. The three of us became a unit, carving out a rhythm that felt solid. I'd catch myself laughing, really laughing, and realize how far I'd come. One evening, I got a call from Jake. He was still in Red Deer, working at a mechanic shop. "You ever coming back, Em?" he asked, half teasing. "Maybe to visit," I said, leaning against my dorm window, watching rain streak the glass. "But this is home now." He chuckled. Knew you'd ditch us for the big city. We talked for an hour, catching up. And when I hung up, I felt a pang of nostalgia, but no regret. Red Deer was part of me, but Vancouver was where I was growing. The next fall, my second year at UBC, I got a letter. Not an email, an actual envelope, postmarked from Calgary. My hands shook as I opened it. It was from Mom. Emily, it started, her handwriting wobbly. I don't know if you'll read this, but I need you to know I'm sorry. We messed up, me and your dad. Losing you and Sophie showed us that. We're trying to fix things. I hope you're happy out there. No mention of Dad's voice in it, just hers. I read it twice, then set it on my desk, unsure what to feel. Sorry was a start, but it didn't erase the years. I didn't write back, not yet. I needed time. Grandpa called that weekend, and I told him about the letter. He grunted, thoughtful. Up to you what you do with it, he said. But don't let it pull you back unless you're ready. I nodded into the phone, grateful for his steady calm. Liam noticed my mood at the next writing club meeting, nudging me after. You okay? He asked, concern in his eyes. I told him about the letter, the mess of it all. He listened, then said, You don't owe them anything, you know. You're building something here. His words settled me, and when he squeezed my hand, I didn't pull away. By winter, I'd found my stride. Classes were harder, but I thrived, top marks, a TA gig lined up for next year. The bookstore promoted me to shift lead, and I started saving for a trip with Priya and Liam, maybe Toronto or Montreal after exams. Sophie stayed on my mind, though. Sarah sent updates. She was in a good home, learning sign language, smiling in photos. I asked if I could visit her someday, and Sarah said she'd arrange it when the time was right. It wasn't closure, but it was a thread I could hold on to. One night, snow-dusting Vancouver streets, I stood on the dorm roof with Liam. We'd snuck up there with hot chocolate, the city glittering below. 2 years ago, I didn't think I'd get here, I said, breath fogging in the cold. He looked at me, steady. You fought for it. That's why you're here. I smiled, leaning into him, the weight of the past lighter than ever. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living fully on my terms. And whatever came next, I knew I could handle it. Spring came to Vancouver with a burst of cherry blossoms, painting the campus pink against the gray of lingering rain. My second year at UBC was winding down, and life had settled into a rhythm I could feel in my bones classes, the bookstore, late nights with Priya and Liam. I'd started writing more outside the club, short stories that piled up on my laptop, each one a little braver than the last. Liam kept pushing me to submit them somewhere, his quiet confidence rubbing off on me. You've got something real, he'd say, flipping through my latest draft. I'd roll my eyes, but secretly, I was starting to believe him. Exams hit hard that May, and the three of us turned our dorm into a war zone of textbooks and energy drinks. Priya's biology notes were a mess of neon highlighters, while Liam sprawled on the floor, muttering film theory to himself. I powered through my lit finals, churning out essays on Atwood and Orwell that left my hands cramped but my mind buzzing. When the last one was done, we celebrated with cheap beer and a hike up Grouse Mountain. The view from the top city below, ocean stretching west, felt like a reward I'd earned. Priya snapped a photo of me and Liam against the skyline, my hair whipping in the wind, his arms slung casually around my shoulders. I kept that picture, tacked it above my desk as a reminder of the good days. Summer brought a shift. The bookstore cut hours, so I picked up extra shifts at a cafe near Kitsilano Beach, steaming lattes and dodging sunburned tourists. The tips were solid, and I stashed them away for the Toronto trip we'd planned. Priya landed a research gig at UBC, dissecting fish or something equally gross, while Liam took a job at a record store downtown. We'd meet up after work, wandering the seawall or crashing at someone's place with takeout and playlists. One night, under the glow of string lights on Priya's balcony, Liam kissed me soft, unexpected, but right. I kissed him back, the city humming around us, and after that, things between us shifted into something deeper, unspoken but steady. Back in Red Deer, Grandpa kept me grounded. We'd talk every Sunday, his voice a tether to the prairies. He'd started gardening, of all things, tomatoes and carrots in his backyard, cursing the rabbits that nibbled them. "Keeps me busy," he'd grumble, but I could hear the pride in it. Aunt Sarah sent photos of his lopsided rows, and I'd laugh, picturing him out there with his old straw hat. He asked about Mom's letter once, gentle but direct. "Thought about it yet?" I sighed. "Not really. Maybe soon." He didn't push, just said, "You'll know when," and moved on to complaining about the weather. Then, in August, Sarah called with news that stopped me cold. "Sophie's foster family, they're adopting her," she said, her voice bright but careful. "It's official next month." I was wiping down tables at the cafe, rag in hand, and had to sit down. Adoption meant permanence. A new family for her. "She's happy," Sarah added. "They've got a big yard, a dog. She loves it." I swallowed hard, a mix of relief and loss twisting in my chest. "Can I still see her?" I asked. "They're open to it," Sarah said. "I'll set it up." When I hung up, I stared out the cafe window at the beachgoers, feeling like a piece of my old life was slipping away, but in a way that might be okay. Third year at UBC kicked off with a bang. I took on the TA gig for a first-year English class, grading papers and leading tutorials. It was terrifying at first, standing in front of 20 wide-eyed kids, but I found my footing. The prof, Dr. Patel, was sharp and funny, and she mentored me through it, slipping me books to read on the side. My own classes got heavier senior seminars, a creative writing workshop, and I leaned into them, my stories growing darker, more layered. Liam read every one, sprawled on my bed with a pencil, marking spots he loved. "This one's gold," he'd say, tapping a page. "Send it out." I finally did, submitting to a small literary mag. When they accepted it, I screamed so loud Priya thought I'd seen a spider. The Toronto trip happened over reading week in October. We flew out, me, Liam, Priya, cramming into a budget hotel near the CN Tower. The city was a shock after Vancouver's laid-back sprawl, tall, loud, alive with horns and lights. We hit the usual spots: the Tower, Kensington Market, a Leafs game where Liam cheered too loud and got us glares. At night, we'd wander Yonge Street, eating street meat and dodging sketchy guys with flyers. One day, standing by Lake Ontario, the wind cutting through my jacket, I felt a rush. This was mine. A moment I'd made happen. Priya snapped another photo, me laughing between her and Liam, and I knew I'd keep that one too. Back home, the mag published my story in November. Seeing my name in print, Emily Carter, the long shadow felt surreal. Grandpa ordered 10 copies, bragging to his buddies at the Legion. Jake texted congrats from Red Deer, joking, "You're famous now, eh?" Even Dr. Patel brought it up in class, beaming. It wasn't big, just a start, but it lit something in me. I wrote more, submitted more, each rejection stinging less, each acceptance pushing me harder. Liam started calling me the writer, half teasing, half proud, and I didn't hate it. Christmas that year was different. I flew back to Red Deer, but Sarah met me at the airport with news. "Mom wanted to see me." "She's been asking," Sarah said, eyeing me over her coffee. As we sat in the terminal, "No pressure, but she's different lately. Quieter." I chewed my lip, unsure. Grandpa weighed in later, over dinner. "She's been going to therapy, from what Sarah hears." Dad, too. "Up to you, kid." I slept on it, the idea churning. The next day, I said yes, not a full reunion, just coffee, neutral ground. We met at a Tim Hortons in Calgary, me and Mom. Grandpa in the truck outside as backup. She looked older, lines deeper around her eyes, but her hands shook less than I remembered. "I didn't get it," she started, staring at her cup. "How much we hurt you." "I'm sorry, Emily. For all of it." Her voice broke, and I sat there, silent, letting it sink in. "I miss you," she added. "And Sophie, she's good, but she asks about you." I nodded, throat tight. "I'm glad she's okay," I said finally. "I needed to leave, Mom. I'm building something now." She looked up, eyes wet. "I see that. I'm proud." We didn't hug, didn't fix everything, but it was a crack in the wall, small, fragile, but there. Back at UBC, I told Liam about it over burgers at the Nest. "Sounds like a start," he said, stealing a fry. "You're tougher than me, I'd have bolted." I laughed, but it stuck with me. Maybe I was tough, carving out this life step by step. Spring brought more another story published, a summer internship at a Vancouver press. Sophie's adoption went through, and Sarah sent a photo. Her with her new family, grinning by a swing set. I taped it next to Priya's pictures, a quiet promise to see her soon. By summer, I was 21, standing on the edge of my third year. The city mine, in a way it hadn't been before. Liam and I rented a tiny apartment, off-campus, leaky faucet, creaky floors, but ours. Priya crashed there half the time, her lab coat slung over our couch. I wrote at a thrift store desk by the window, the harbor glinting outside, each word a piece of me taking root. The past wasn't gone. Mom's apology lingered. Sophie's absence ached, but it didn't own me. I'd built this, fought for it, and as the sun set over the water, I knew I was exactly where I was meant to be. Fall swept into Vancouver with a damp chill, the leaves along Main Street turning gold and red as my third year at UBC rolled on. The little apartment Liam and I shared became our sanctuary small, cluttered with books and mismatched mugs, but alive with us. I'd wake to the sound of him humming in the kitchen, flipping pancakes on our ancient stove, while I hunched over my desk, hammering out stories or grading papers for my TA gig. Priya would burst in most mornings, stealing bites of breakfast before dragging us to campus, her energy a constant spark in our quiet routine. The internship at this Vancouver press started in June and stretched into the fall, a whirlwind of deadlines and coffee runs. I was the youngest there, surrounded by editors with sharp eyes and sharper tongues, but they took me seriously. My job was grunt work at first proofreading, fetching files, but I soaked up everything. The rhythm of a newsroom, the way a good sentence could shift a whole piece. My boss, Claire, a wiry woman with a smoker's rasp, caught me rewriting a draft one day. "You've got an eye," she said, peering over her glasses. "Keep at it." Soon, she was slipping me small assignments, book reviews, local event blurbs. My name started popping up in print more, tiny bylines that felt like victories. School didn't let up either. The writing workshop pushed me harder, my prof tearing into my stories with a red pen and a grin. "You're getting gutsy, Carter," he'd say, tossing my draft back. "Now make it hurt more." I did, digging into the raw edges of memory Alberta's cold basements, the weight of unspoken expectations turning them into fiction that stung. Liam read every revision, sprawled on our couch, his feedback gentle but honest. "This one's gonna stick with people," he said after a late-night session, kissing my forehead. His belief kept me going, even when the rejections piled up beside the wins. Priya's lab work took off too. She'd landed a grant to study coastal ecosystems, spending half her time knee-deep in tide pools. She'd come home soaked, ranting about crabs or algae, and we'd listen, half laughing, over bowls of ramen. Liam's record store gig turned into a passion. He'd bring home vinyls, spinning Bowie or Fleetwood Mac while we cooked. Our nights blurred into debates about music and plots, the three of us tangled in a friendship that felt unbreakable. One rainy evening, Priya grinned at me across the table. "We're a weird little family, huh?" I nodded, warmth spreading through me. "Yeah, we were." Back in Red Deer, Grandpa's garden thrived despite his grumbling. He mailed me a jar of homemade tomato sauce, the label scrawled in his shaky hand, "Don't waste it." I laughed, saving it for a Sunday when Liam and I made spaghetti, the kitchen a mess of flour and giggles. Our calls stretched longer now. He'd ramble about the neighbors or the truck's latest breakdown, then ask about my writing. "Heard you're a big shot now," he teased after Claire ran my first feature, a piece on Vancouver's indie bookstores. "Just a small shot," I shot back, but I could hear him beaming through the phone. Sophie stayed on my mind. Sarah sent updates every few months. Her new family had settled in Kelowna, a house with a view of Okanagan Lake. She was 9 now, taller in the photos, her smile wide as she held a scruffy terrier. "They're teaching her to swim," Sarah wrote. "She loves the water." I traced her face on my screen, guilt and love nodding together. I hadn't seen her yet. Sarah said the timing wasn't right with the adoption still fresh, but I started planning. Maybe spring break, a road trip east. I owed her that much, even if it scared me. Mom reached out again in November, a phone call this time. I was at the press, elbow deep in edits, when her number flashed. I stepped outside, the drizzle cold on my face. "Emily," she said, voice softer than before. "I just wanted to hear you." We talked awkward, halting about nothing big. The weather, her new job at a grocery store. Dad was there too, quieter, working construction again. "We're trying," she said before hanging up. "I hope you know that." I didn't say much, but I didn't hang up angry. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was something a thread I didn't cut. Winter hit hard, blanketing campus in fog and frost. The press gave me a bigger piece, a profile on a local author, my first solo interview. I prepped for days, nerves jangling, but it went well, her laugh filling the cafe as we talked. When it ran, Claire slapped the paper on my desk. "Solid work, kid." "You're staying on next term." I called Grandpa that night, giddy, and he whooped so loud I had to pull the phone away. Liam cooked us a celebratory dinner, burnt chicken and all, and Priya toasted me with a can of soda. "To Emily," the word wizard, she said, and I blushed, but I drank to it. Spring break came, and I made good on my plan. Liam borrowed a friend's beat-up Honda, and we drove to Kelowna, 6 hours through mountains and rain, playlists blaring. Sarah met us there, her SUV parked outside Sophie's new home. I stood on the porch, heart hammering, when the door swung open. Sophie ran out, skinny legs and a gap-toothed grin, crashing into me with a hug. Her adoptive mom, Jen, followed, smiling. "She's been asking about you," Jen said. We spent the day together, Sophie dragging me to the lake, splashing me with icy water. Her laugh loud and wild. Liam snapped pictures. Sarah teared up, and I held Sophie's hand, feeling the years melt a little. "I'll come back," I whispered as we left. She nodded, like she understood. Back at UBC, my final year loomed. I declared a double major, English and journalism, locking in my path. The press offered me a part-time gig, balancing it with school. My stories kept selling small mags at first. Then a bigger one in Toronto picked up a piece about the Kelowna trip, titled Finding Water. Liam framed the clipping, hanging it in our apartment. "You're unstoppable," he said, and I started to believe it. Priya got into grad school at UBC, screaming when the letter came, and we celebrated with a bonfire on Wreck Beach, the flames dancing against the night. Mom and Dad visited Vancouver that summer, their first trip out. We met at a diner near the harbor, neutral, safe. Dad was grayer, quieter, but he shook Liam's hand, asked about my work. Mom hugged me, tentative, and we talked, really talked about Sophie, about what they'd lost, about what I'd built. "We were wrong," Dad said, voice low. "Took too long to see it." I nodded, not forgiving outright, but letting it sit. They stayed 2 days, and when they left, Mom pressed a photo into my hand, me and Sophie as kids, laughing in the snow. "Keep it," she said. I did, tucking it into my desk drawer. By fall, I was 22, staring down graduation. The press offered me full-time after, and I said yes, writing, editing, chasing stories. Liam proposed one night, casual over pizza, a thrift store ring glinting in his hand. "No rush," he said, grinning. "Just want you with me." I laughed, said yes, and we kept it quiet, just ours for now. Priya rolled her eyes when I told her, muttering, "Took him long enough," but she hugged us both. Grandpa cried when I called him, then laughed it off, promising to dance at the wedding. Graduation day was chaos, robes, cheers, a sea of faces. Grandpa flew out, Sarah too, and they sat with Liam and Priya, hollering as I crossed the stage. My diploma felt heavy, real, a piece of proof I'd made it. Afterward, we ate fish and chips by the water, the sun sinking low. I looked around Grandpa's crinkled smile, Sarah's proud nod, Priya's chatter, Liam's hand in mine, and felt full. The past was there, a shadow, but it didn't choke me anymore. I'd written my way out, built a life word by word, and as the waves rolled in, I knew this was just the beginning. Summer after graduation settled over Vancouver like a warm blanket, the city buzzing with festivals and sun-soaked days. I started full-time at the press, my desk a chaotic nest of notebooks, pens, and half-empty coffee cups. Claire kept me busy, features on local artists, deep dives into housing debates, even a travel piece on Haida Gwaii that sent me north for a week. I'd hike back to the apartment late, ink-stained and tired, but alive with the thrill of it. Liam would be there, vinyl spinning, dinner simmering, usually edible now that he'd mastered more than chicken. "You're a proper journalist," he'd tease, kissing my forehead. I'd grin, too tired to argue, but loving the sound of it. Priya dove into grad school with her usual chaos, her room at our place a revolving door of lab gear and textbooks. She'd stumble in after midnight, ranting about fish dissections or grant proposals, and we'd listen, sprawled on the couch with tea or beer. Our little trio held strong, even as life pulled us in new directions. Liam's record store promoted him to manager, and he started booking local bands for gigs, his quiet charm winning over musicians and customers alike. We'd go to his shows, Priya and me cheering from the back, the bass thumping through smoky rooms. It was a good chaos, ours, and I clung to it. Grandpa visited in July, his first big trip since graduation. He marveled at the apartment fancy for a couple of kids, he said, eyeing our thrift store couch, and insisted on cooking for us, turning out a roast so tender it rivaled any restaurant. We took him to Stanley Park, walking the seawall as he pointed out birds with the glee of a kid. "You've done all right, Emily," he said one evening, sitting on our balcony with a glass of whiskey. "Better than all right." His pride hit me hard, and I hugged him tight, the salt air mixing with the faint scent of his aftershave. When he left, he slipped me a carved wooden box for your treasures. He winked, and I kept it on my desk, a piece of red deer in Vancouver. Work took off in August. Claire pitched me a series on youth mental health, a big swing she thought I could handle. I spent weeks interviewing kids across the city teens in shelters, students juggling jobs and school, voices raw with stories not so different from mine. It was heavy, peeling back layers I'd buried, but I poured it into the writing. The first piece ran in September, front page, and the response floored me, emails from readers, calls from nonprofits wanting to talk. Claire clapped me on the back. "Told you, kid, you're hitting nerves." I framed that issue, hung it beside Liam's clippings, a quiet badge of what I could do. Fall brought wedding talk, though Liam and I kept it loose. We'd sit on the floor with takeout, tossing ideas, maybe a small thing in Red Deer, maybe just us and a few friends on a beach. Priya, self-appointed planner, started a notebook of ridiculous suggestions. "Elope on a ferry," she'd cackle, doodling boats. We laughed, but the ring on my finger still that thrift store find felt heavier, realer. Grandpa called it settling into your bones, and he wasn't wrong. Liam and I were a team, steady through the whirlwind, and I liked the idea of making it official someday. Sophie's 10th birthday came in October, and I couldn't miss it. Sarah set it up a weekend in Kelowna, me and Liam driving out again. Jen welcomed us with coffee and a grin, the house loud with kids and barking dogs. Sophie tackled me at the door, taller now, her arms strong around my waist. We spent the day building a kite, her idea. My shaky hands, fumbling with string, then flew it by the lake, the wind tugging it high. She giggled, pointing as it dipped and soared, and I watched her, chest tight with a love I couldn't name. Jen pulled me aside later. "She talks about you all the time," she said. "You're her hero." I blinked back tears, promising to visit more. And when we left, Sophie waved until we were out of sight. Back in Vancouver, the mental health series wrapped in November, 5 pieces that left me drained but proud. It won a regional award, nothing huge, but Claire threw a party at the office, cheap wine and all. The team toasted me, and I stood there, glass raised, feeling the weight of their trust. Liam whispered, "Told you unstoppable," and I elbowed him, grinning. The award sat on our shelf, next to Grandpa's box, a marker of a year that had tested me and proved me right. Winter crept in, and Mom called again. She'd been steady with the grocery job, Dad with construction, both clawing back from the mess they'd made. "We're moving," she said, voice tentative. "Small place in Lethbridge. Fresh start." I listened, stirring soup on the stove, and asked why. "Too many ghosts here," she admitted. "And we want to be closer, if you'll let us." I didn't commit, but I didn't say no. We talked longer about Sophie, about my work, and when Dad got on, gruff but soft, he said, "You're doing good out there. Always knew you would." It wasn't absolution, but it was a bridge, shaky but standing. Spring hit with a vengeance, rain giving way to sun, and the press sent me to Haida again, this time for a cultural festival. I flew out alone, notebook in hand, and spent days with artists and elders, their stories weaving into mine. The islands were wild, misty, alive with a quiet power that sank into me. I wrote at night, the ocean roaring outside my cabin, and sent the draft to Claire from a spotty cafe signal. She called it my best yet, and when it ran, readers flooded my inbox again. I walked the beach after, boots crunching on pebbles, and felt the vastness of it all, how far I'd come, how much I still wanted. Liam met me at the airport when I got back, pulling me into a hug that smelled of vinyl and home. We drove to Wreck Beach that night, just us, sitting on a driftwood log as the sun dipped low. "You ever think about slowing down?" he asked, half smiling. "Not yet," I said, leaning into him. "Too much to chase." He nodded, understanding, and we watched the waves, the future stretching out like the horizon. Priya joined us later, fresh from a lab triumph, some breakthrough with seaweed, and we stayed until dark, the three of us laughing under the stars. Summer rolled around again, and I turned 23. The press offered me a raise, a bigger beat city life, human stories. I took it, hungry for more. Liam's store thrived, booking bigger acts, and he started writing songs, rough, earnest tunes he'd play for me late at night. Priya aced her first year of grad school, eyeing a PhD. We celebrated my birthday at the apartment, a cramped party with Grandpa flying out, Sarah and Uncle Tom driving down, even Jen and Sophie video calling in. The room was loud, warm, full of people who'd carried me here. Grandpa raised a glass. "To Emily, who never quits," and I laughed, tears pricking my eyes. Fall loomed, and Mom texted about Lethbridge. "We're settled. Doors open if you're near." I showed Liam, and he shrugged. Road trip? We went in September, a long drive through the Rockies, the truck rattling with every mile. Their new place was small, tidy, a far cry from Calgary's ghost. Dad grilled burgers, Mom fussed over sides, and we ate in their backyard, the tension thinner than before. "We're proud," Mom said, catching my eye. "Really?" I nodded, letting it land. We didn't erase the past, but we built something new, a visit, a meal, a start. Back in Vancouver, I wrote about it not for the press, just for me. The story sat on my laptop, unfinished, a piece of where I'd been and where I was going. Liam read it one night, quiet after. "It's you," he said simply. I smiled, curling into him, the city alive outside our window. Life wasn't perfect. Sophie was far, Mom and Dad were mending, work was relentless, but it was mine. Every word, every mile, every fight. And as the rain tapped the glass, I knew I'd keep writing it, line by line, into whatever came next. Winter settled over Vancouver with a damp, gray hush, the kind that seeped into your bones if you let it. I was 23 now, deep into my beat at the press, chasing stories through the city's fog-draped streets. The apartment hummed with life, Liam's guitar strumming late into the night, my keyboard clacking as I filed pieces on everything from transit strikes to neighborhood poets. Priya was a constant whirlwind, her grad school chaos spilling over with stacks of research papers and wild tales of lab mishaps. We'd carved out a balance, the three of us, threading our dreams through the rhythm of rain and deadlines. The press kept me on my toes. Claire handed me a new assignment in January, a long-form investigation into the city's overdose crisis. It was my biggest yet, a tangle of stats, interviews, and late nights sifting through coroner reports. I'd sit with outreach workers in the downtown East Side, their voices rough with exhaustion, then trek to suburban clinics where parents whispered about lost kids. The weight of it pressed on me, but I dug in, weaving their words into something sharp and clear. Liam watched me wrestle with it, bringing me tea when I forgot to eat. "You're doing something real," he'd say, rubbing my shoulders. "Don't burn out." I nodded, but the fire to get it right kept me going. Spring broke through in March, the cherry blossoms exploding again, and my piece ran 10 pages in the weekend edition, photos stark against my text. The response was immediate. Letters, calls, a flood of shares online. A harm reduction group invited me to speak at their fundraiser, and I stood there, voice steady, telling a room of strangers what I'd learned. Claire called it a game changer, slapping the paper on my desk with a rare grin. You're not just reporting now, you're shifting things. That night, Liam and I split a bottle of wine, toasting on our tiny balcony as the city glowed below. It wasn't just pride, it was purpose, sinking deep. Priya's PhD track solidified that spring she'd scored funding for a 3-year project on marine pollution, grinning like a kid when she told us. I'm gonna save the ocean, she declared, waving a grant letter. We celebrated at a dive bar near campus, Liam slipping the bartender a playlist that turned the night into a dance party. He'd been writing more, his songs tighter now, and a local band asked him to open for them at a gig. I stood in the crowd with Priya, watching him strum under dim lights, his voice raw and sure. He's good, she shouted over the noise, and I nodded, chest swelling. We were all climbing, each in our lane, but together. Grandpa called in April, his voice crackly but warm. Saw your big story, he said. Made me cry, and I don't cry easy. I laughed, picturing him in his Red Deer kitchen, newspaper spread out. He'd taken up painting watercolors, of all things, sending me blurry photos of smudged landscapes. Not as good as your words, he'd joke. But I saved them, taping one to our fridge. He asked about Mom and Dad, casual but pointed. They're steady in Lethbridge, I said. We're talking. He hummed approval. Good. Family's messy, but it's yours. Sophie's 11th birthday rolled around in October, and I drove to Kelowna again, this time with Priya tagging along. Curious to meet her. Jen greeted us with pumpkin pie, the house festive with streamers and a lopsided cake. Sophie was all energy, dragging us to her room to show off a science kit she'd gotten. Look! She beamed, mixing powders that fizzed and smoked. Priya jumped in, nerding out over the reactions, and I watched them, a quiet ache easing. We stayed the weekend, hiking around Knox Mountain, Sophie chattering about school and her dog. Jen pulled me aside before we left. She's thriving, she said, but you're still her big sister. I hugged Sophie tight, promising a summer visit, and drove back with her laughter echoing in my head. Work hit a peak in November. The Overdose series sparked a follow-up profiles on survivors, gritty and hopeful. I spent days with a guy named Matt, a former addict turned counselor, his scars a map of where he'd been. His story ran on Christmas Eve, and the press office buzzed with feedback readers donating to his program, politicians calling for meetings. Claire gave me a nod, rare praise in her clipped tone. You're making noise, Carter. Keep it up. I framed that one too, the shelf in our apartment now a gallery of moments I'd fought for. Liam's music took off that winter. His band gig turned into a regular slot, then a recording session with a small label. He'd come home wired, strumming riffs on the couch, asking my opinion on lyrics. You're my muse, he'd grin, and I'd shove him, laughing. We set a wedding date next summer, small, on a bluff near Tofino. Priya was already sketching dresses, swearing she'd make it epic, but chill. I liked the simplicity of it, us, the ocean, a handful of people who mattered. Grandpa promised to wear a tie, grumbling all the way. Mom and Dad came out in February, a surprise visit that caught me off guard. They'd called ahead, asking if it was okay, and I'd said yes, curious. We met at a cafe near Granville Island, the air thick with salt and coffee. Dad looked worn but solid, Mom nervous but warm. We read your pieces, she said, clutching a mug. They're powerful. Dad nodded. Didn't know you had all that in you. We talked about Lethbridge, their jobs, the slow rebuild of their lives. We'd like to come more, Mom ventured. If you're okay with it. I thought of Sophie, of Bridges, and said, yeah, let's try. They smiled small, real. And when they left, I felt lighter, like a knot had loosened. Spring brought chaos and calm. The press sent me to Victoria for a conference, a blur of panels and networking that landed me a freelance gig with a national mag. I rode on the ferry back, the water choppy under a setting sun, words flowing fast. Liam's first EP dropped 5 tracks, his voice threading through, and we threw a release party at the apartment. Neighbors banging on the walls by midnight. Priya's research hit a breakthrough, her name on a paper that got buzz in science circles. We're killing it, she said, clinking a beer against mine. And I laughed, knowing she was right. Summer arrived, and the wedding crept closer. We drove to Tofino in June, scouting the spot a cliff with waves crashing below, wind whipping the grass. Grandpa flew out early, staying with us, his suitcase stuffed with bad jokes and that promised tie. Sarah and Uncle Tom came too, turning it into a family reunion. Sophie and Jen drove down, her excitement spilling over as she ran circles on the beach. The day itself was perfect sun low, vows short, Liam's hands steady in mine. Priya officiated, half laughing through it, and Grandpa danced with me after, his steps clumsy but sure. Mom and Dad were there, quiet in the back, their presence a fragile gift. Fall found me 24, settled into a life I'd built brick by brick. The press promoted me staff writer now, my own column brewing. Liam's EP got airplay, gigs piling up, and he started teaching music part-time. Priya's PhD rolled on, her lab a second home. We bought a bigger place, a walk-up near Commercial Drive, creaky but ours room for Sophie to visit, for Grandpa's painting to hang. I wrote about the wedding for that national mag, a quiet piece about love and second chances, and it sold out the issue. Mom sent a card after beautiful, she wrote, and I kept it, tucked in Grandpa's box. Winter loomed again, and I stood at our new window, watching snow dust the street. Sophie's latest letter, scrawled in crayon, sat on the counter, full of dog stories and summer plans. Liam strummed behind me. Priya texted about a lab crisis, and I smiled. The past was there, scarred, messy mine, but it didn't rule me. I'd written my way through it, loved my way past it, and as the city glowed outside, I knew the next chapter was just beginning. Spring arrived in Vancouver with a gentle thaw, the snow melting into puddles that reflected the city's restless energy. I was 24. My column at the press, now a monthly fixture sharp, takes on urban life, threads of my own past woven in subtle enough to sting without breaking. The walk-up near Commercial Drive felt like home, its quirks leaky windows, a stove that took coaxing ours to wrestle with. Liam's guitar leaned against the wall, my desk by the window piled with drafts, and Priya's muddy boots sat by the door from her latest fieldwork jaunt. We'd made it a nest, rough-edged but warm. Work stretched me thin that season. The Overdose series had opened doors, and Claire pitched me a book deal with a small publisher, a collection of my features, expanded with new reporting. I said yes, the idea daunting but electric. Days blurred into interviews and late-night writing, my laptop glowing while Liam slept. He'd wake to find me hunched over it, bleary-eyed, and drag me to bed with a laugh. "You're a machine," he'd murmur, arms around me. "A tired one," I'd mutter back, but the grind felt right, like I was carving something permanent. Priya's PhD hit its second year, and she was a force leading a team now, her name popping up at conferences. She'd barge in with tales of boat trips gone wrong, once dumping a soggy bag of seaweed on our table to show us the good stuff. Liam groaned, but I laughed, snapping a photo for Grandpa. She'd scored a summer stint in Haida Gwaii, and we planned to visit me for research, here for work, Liam just to surf. "We're a crew," she said, grinning, and I couldn't argue. Our roots ran deep, tangled in the best way. Liam's music steadied too. The EP's buzz landed him a slot at a folk festival in July, and I watched him on stage in Victoria, his voice cutting through the crowd. He'd grown into it, confident, loose, the kid from Kelowna, now a name people whispered. After, we walked the harbor, his hand in mine, the lights dancing on the water. "You think we're doing okay?" he asked, half serious. "Better than okay," I said, and he smiled, the kind that lit me up. His teaching gig expanded, kids flocking to his lessons, and he started saving for a studio, dreaming out loud over breakfast. Grandpa turned 75 that May, and we flew to Red Deer for it. Sarah threw a bash in his backyard, lanterns strung up, a bonfire crackling. The whole family crammed in. He'd painted a sign, Jack's Big 75, and hung it crooked over the porch. Sophie came with Jen, bounding over to show me a sketchbook full of dogs and kites. "You're famous," she said, pointing at my column in a paper Sarah had brought. I hugged her, laughing, and danced with her by the fire, her giggles loud against the prairie quiet. Mom and Dad were there too, softer now, helping with food. "Good to see you," Mom said, tentative. You too, I replied, meaning it more than before. The book took shape over summer. I holed up in Haida Gwaii with Priya for a week, her boat rocking as I typed, the island's wildness seeping into my words. Elders shared tea and stories loss, resilience, hope, and I wove them in, my own thread alongside theirs. Liam joined us midweek, surfboard under arm, and we'd collapse on the beach at night, salt stiff and content. The draft finished there, rough but alive, and I sent it to Claire from a cafe in Massette. She called 2 days later. It's raw, Carter. They'll eat it up. I exhaled, the weight lifting just enough. Fall slammed me back to reality. The publisher set a release for next spring, Overdose City. Voices from the Edge and I dove into edits, juggling it with the column. The press threw me a curveball too, a week in Ottawa, covering a policy summit. My first national beat. I flew out, nervous but ready, and spent days in suits and snow, scribbling notes as MPs debated. My piece ran live, sharp and unsparing, and the feedback hit hard praise from peers, hate mail from critics. I framed the hate mail, grinning as Liam hung it in the kitchen. Badge of honor, he said, kissing me. Sophie visited in November, her first solo trip to Vancouver. Jen dropped her off, and we filled the weekend zoo trips, pizza nights, here sprawled on our couch with a book. She'd grown quiet sometimes, thoughtful, and one night asked, "Did you leave because of me?" I froze, then sat beside her. "No," I said, firm. "Never you. I left to find me, but I'm still your sister." She nodded, leaning into me. And we stayed like that, TV flickering. When she left, she slipped a drawing into my bag, us by the lake, kites high. I taped it to the fridge, next to Grandpa's painting. Winter deepened, and Mom called from Lethbridge. "We're coming for Christmas," she said, hesitant. "If that's all right." I glanced at Liam, who shrugged your call. "Yeah," I said. "Bring Dad." They arrived Christmas Eve, arms full of gifts and awkward smiles. We cooked Mom's stuffing, my lopsided pie, and talked, not deep but easy, about their new neighbors, my book. Dad fixed our leaky faucet, muttering about shoddy pipes, and it felt normal, fragile, but real. They stayed 2 nights, and when they left, Mom hugged me long, whispering, "You're enough." I nodded, throat tight, and watched them drive off. The book launched in April, a packed event at a Gastown bookstore. Claire emceed, Liam beamed. Priya whooped from the back. Grandpa flew out, Sarah too, and Sophie sat front row with Jen, clapping loudest. I read a chapter Matt's story, the counselor, my voice steady despite the crowd. Copies sold out, hands shook mine, and a reviewer called it unflinching. We celebrated after at a pub, beer flowing, Grandpa toasting to my writer girl. Mom and Dad sent a card, proud doesn't cover it, and I kept it. A quiet echo of their visit. Summer burned bright. Liam's festival slot turned into a mini-tour, 6 towns, me tagging along for half, writing on the road. Priya's Haida Gwaii stint wrapped with a published paper, her name in bold. We hit Tofino again, just us 3, camping by the cliffs where we'd wed. "Look at us," Priya said, firelight on her face. "Kicking ass." I laughed, Liam's arm around me, the waves a steady roar. Sophie joined us for a day, surfing with Liam, her squeals cutting through the wind. I watched, notebook idle, letting the moment sink in. Fall found me 25. The book a steady seller, my column a local staple. The press offered a podcast me narrating stories, digging deeper, and I jumped in. Voice shaking on the first mic test. Liam's tour paid off, a second EP brewing. And he bought that studio, a cramped space we painted blue. Priya proposed her dissertation, a beast of a project, and we toasted with whiskey on our balcony. Grandpa sent a watercolor of our wedding cliff, shaky but vivid, and I hung it above my desk. Winter crept back, and Sophie called her voice on our answering machine, bright. "Come for my birthday." I smiled, planning already. Mom texted too, a photo of their Lethbridge snowman visit soon. I showed Liam, and he nodded. "Family road trip," he said. And I agreed. The threads of my life, Vancouver, Red Deer, Kelowna, Lethbridge, tying tighter. Not choking, but holding. I sat at my desk that night, podcast script open, Liam strumming across the room, and felt it. Not just survival, but a life full, loud, mine. The story wasn't done, I'd keep writing it, every damn day. Spring rolled into Vancouver with a burst of green. The city shaking off winter's grip as cherry blossoms littered the streets like confetti. I was 25. The podcast to hit my voice, now a weekly hum in strangers' ears, unpacking stories of grit and grace. The walk up on Commercial Drive creaked under our growing life. Liam's studio gear spilling into the living room, my bookshelves bowing with research, Priya's sea samples stashed in jars by the sink. It was chaos, but it was ours, a loud testament to where we'd landed. The press kept me busy. The book's success Overdose City still selling. A reprint in the works pushed Claire to pitch me a sequel, this time on housing. "You've got the chops," she said, tossing me a stack of reports. "Show them the mess." I dove in, tracing the city's skyline through tent camps and glass towers, talking to tenants and builders until my notebook bled ink. Nights stretched long, Liam strumming in the background as I typed, his quiet presence a lifeline. "You're gonna fix the world," he'd joke, sliding me a sandwich. One word at a time, I'd shoot back, half serious. Priya's dissertation loomed, a monster of data and deadlines. She'd pace our place, muttering about salinity levels, then vanish to the lab for days. When she surfaced, it was with wild eyes and takeout, regaling us with tales of near-disaster spilled samples, a boat engine that quit mid-straight. "I'm this close to cracking it," she'd say, pinching her fingers. And we'd cheer her on, her fire contagious. Her Haida Gui paper got cited in a big journal, and she framed the page, hanging it in our hall. "Next stop, Professor," Liam teased, and she smirked, unstoppable. Liam's second EP dropped in June, rawer than the first. His tour scars etched into every track. It climbed local charts, gigs multiplying bars, festivals, even a radio spot that had me grinning at the kitchen table as his voice crackled through. The studio became his haven, kids trailing in for lessons, their chatter mixing with his chords. He'd come home late, buzzing, and we'd sit on the floor, picking apart melodies. "You're my anchor," he said one night, guitar across his lap. I kissed him, soft and sure, the ring on my finger catching the light. We were solid, a rhythm we'd built note by note. Grandpa's 76th hit in May, and we flew to Red Deer again. He'd turned his backyard into a jungle veggies, flowers, a birdhouse he'd painted red. The party was smaller this time, just family, but loud with laughter. Sophie ran over, taller now, her sketchbook swapped for a camera she'd taken up photography, snapping us mid-bite. "For my wall," she said, grinning, and I posed, hamming it up. Mom and Dad helped with the grill, their ease a quiet shift. "You're glowing," Mom said, brushing my hair back. "Life's good," I replied, and she nodded, a truce in her eyes. Dad handed me a beer, gruff but warm. "Keep writing," he said. "It's you." Summer burned hot, and Sophie's birthday pulled us to Kelowna. She was 12, all legs and curiosity, her new family's dog nipping at our heels. Jen had a picnic-ready sandwiches, lemonade, a cake that tilted but tasted fine. We swam in the lake, Sophie dunking me with a cackle, Liam towing her on a floaty. She showed me her photos' blurry birds, sharp sunsets, and I marveled at her eye. "You should visit more," she said, serious. "I will," I promised, meaning it. And Jen smiled, approving. We left with sunburns and a stack of her prints, one taped to our dash on the drive back. The housing book took root that fall. I crisscrossed Vancouver, from squatters' dens to penthouse lobbies, the city's pulse under my pen. A woman named Rosa, evicted 3 times, became its heart. Her voice cracked as she told me, "Home's a ghost now." I wrote her story late, tears smudging my notes, and sent it to Claire. "This'll hit," she said, voice tight, and it did. Pre-orders spiked before the ink dried. Liam read it first, quiet after. "You make people feel," he said, and I nodded, hoping it was enough. Winter roared in, and the podcast grew sponsors now, a live event booked for March. I prepped in a panic, scripting episodes on renters and rehabs, my voice steadier with each take. Liam's tour hit the prairies, and I joined him for a weekend in Regina, snow piling high as he played to a packed room. I stood backstage, watching him shine, my chest tight with pride. He dedicated a song to me, for the one who stays, and the crowd cheered, my laugh lost in the noise. We drove back slow, stopping at diners, the road a thread between our worlds. Priya defended her dissertation proposal in January, nailing it despite a flu that left her raspy. Dr. Patel in 3 years, she croaked, collapsing on our couch. We toasted with soup, her triumph ours too. Her lab offered a postdoc slot, and she wavered, stay or chase a gig in Halifax. You'd kill it anywhere, I said, and she hugged me, decision pending. Liam strummed a victory tune, and we danced, silly and free, the room warm against the cold. Mom and Dad visited in February. A planned trip this time. They'd settled in Lethbridge, their house a cozy box with a porch swing. We took them to the live podcast taping me on stage, mic hot, talking housing with Rosa beside me. They sat in the crowd, Dad's nod firm, Mom's eyes wet. After, we ate at a diner. Their questions about my work real, not forced. You're changing things, Dad said, voice low. Didn't see that coming. I smiled, softer now. Me neither. They left with a promise Easter in Lethbridge, and I waved. The gap between us shrinking. Spring launched the book Homes We Lose in April, a packed signing at the same Gastown spot. Grandpa flew out, cane in hand. Sophie and Jen beside him. Priya emceed, Liam sold copies, and Rosa hugged me, her grin wide. The line stretched out the door, readers clutching my words, and I signed until my wrist ached. A critic called it urgent, human, and sales soared. The publisher hinting at a third. We celebrated on the seawall, fish and chips in hand, Sophie snapping photos of us against the dusk. You're my hero, she whispered, and I held her close, the weight of it sweet. Summer flared, and Liam's tour circled back BC now, me along for half. Priya took the Halifax postdoc, a tearful goodbye at the airport, her promise to visit firm. You're my anchor, she said, echoing Liam, and I cried, waving as she boarded. We drove to Tofino after, just us, camping where we'd wed. Sophie joined for a night, her camera clicking. And we swam. The ocean cold and alive, I wrote by the fire. A new story brewing not for print, just mine, and Liam played, his chords soft. Grandpa called midweek, voice bright. Painted you a wave, he said. It's coming. Fall found me 26, the podcast a staple, my column sharper. The third book loomed Claire's idea, on youth and cities, and I started, slow but sure. Liam's studio thrived. Kids recording demos, his EP a quiet hit. Priya sent Halifax updates snow, seals, a lab she loved, and Sophie mailed photos, her talent blooming. Mom and Dad hosted Easter, a small feast, and we talked late, their pride plain. I stood in Vancouver that winter, rain tapping the walk-up, Liam beside me, and felt it roots deep, wings wide. A life I'd written into being, still unfolding, page by page. Spring swept into Vancouver with a rush of green, the city shrugging off winter's chill as cherry blossoms scattered the streets like confetti. I was 25, my voice now a weekly pulse in strangers' ears through the podcast, spinning tales of grit and grace. The walk-up on Commercial Drive was truly home noisy, cluttered, but warm to its core. Liam's guitar leaned against the wall, its strings humming late into the night. My desk by the window sagged under stacks of drafts, a battlefield of words. And Priya's mud-caked boots, reeking of sea salt from her latest fieldwork, sat by the door. Together, it was a vivid canvas, a life we'd painted stroke by stroke. Work dragged me into a relentless whirlwind. Overdose City's success still simmered, a reprint in the works, and Claire threw me a new challenge, a book on housing. You've got the chops, she said, shoving a thick pile of reports my way. Expose this mess. I dove in like a storm, tracing the city's pulse from tent camps to glass towers, soaking up the voices of tenants and builders until my notebook bled ink. Late nights stretched on, my fingers flying over the keyboard, Liam strumming softly in the background like an anchor in the dark. You'll fix the whole world, he teased, sliding a sandwich beside me. One word at a time, I shot back, half serious, eyes glued to the screen. Priya was a flame that never flickered. Her PhD roared into its second year, a beast of data and deadlines. She'd burst in, ranting about salinity levels, then vanished to the lab for days. When she resurfaced, it was with wild eyes and takeout, spinning tales of near disasters, spilled samples, a boat engine choking mid-straight. "I'm this close to cracking it," she'd declare, pinching her fingers, and we'd cheer, swept up in her blaze. Her Haida Gui paper got cited in a major journal, and she framed the page, hanging it in our hall. "Next stop, Professor Patel," Liam jabbed, and Priya smirked, a warrior unstoppable. Liam stood steady as ever. His second EP dropped in June. Rougher, truer, etched with the scars of his tours. It climbed local charts, gigs stacking up bars, festivals, even a radio slot that had me grinning over breakfast as his voice crackled through. His studio was a haven now, kids pouring in for lessons, their laughter mingling with his chords. He'd come home late, electric, and we'd sprawl on the floor, dissecting melodies. "You're my anchor," he said one night, guitar across his lap. I kissed him, soft but sure, the ring on my finger glinting in the light. We were a rhythm, a harmony crafted note by note, unshakable. Grandpa's 76th rolled around in May, and we flew to Red Deer to celebrate. He'd turned his backyard into a jungle veggies, flowers, a red-painted birdhouse he'd built himself. The party was smaller this time, just family, but alive with laughter. Sophie rushed over, taller now, her sketchbook swapped for a camera she'd fallen for photography, snapping us mid-bite. For my wall, she grinned, and I struck a goofy pose to make her laugh. Mom and Dad pitched in with the grill, their ease a quiet shift. "You're glowing," Mom said, brushing my hair back. "Life's good," I replied, and she nodded, peace in her eyes. Dad handed me a beer, gruff but warm. "Keep writing," he said, "that's you." Summer blazed bright, and Sophie's birthday pulled us to Kelowna. She was 12, all legs and curiosity, her new family's dog nipping at our heels. Jen had a picnic-ready sandwiches, lemonade, a lopsided cake that tasted just fine. We swam in the lake, Sophie splashing me with a cackle, Liam towing her on a floaty. She showed me her photos' blurry birds, crisp sunsets, and I marveled at her eye. "You should visit more," she said, serious. "I will," I promised, meaning it, and Jen smiled, approving. We left with sunburns and a stack of her prints, one taped to our dashboard the whole drive back. The housing book took root that fall. I roamed Vancouver, from squatters' dens to penthouse lobbies, the city's heartbeat under my pen. A woman named Rosa, evicted 3 times, became its soul. Her voice broke as she told me, "Home's a ghost now." I wrote her story late, tears smudging my notes, and sent it to Claire. "This'll hit," she said, voice taut, and it did. Pre-orders soared before the ink dried. Liam read it first, silent for a long stretch. "You make people feel," he said, and I nodded, hoping it was enough. Winter roared in, and the podcast exploded sponsors now, a live event locked for March. I prepped in a frenzy, scripting episodes on renters and rehabs, my voice firmer with each take. Liam's tour hit the prairies, and I joined him for a weekend in Regina, snow piling high as he played to a packed house. I stood backstage, watching him shine, my chest tight with pride. He dedicated a song to me for the one who stays, and the crowd roared, my laugh lost in the din. We drove back slow, stopping at roadside diners, the highway a thread stitching our worlds together. Priya nailed her dissertation proposal in January, acing it despite a flu that left her raspy. "Dr. Patel in 3 years," she croaked, collapsing on our couch. We toasted with soup, her win ours too. Her lab offered a postdoc slot, and she wavered, "Stay or chase Halifax." "You'd own it anywhere," I said, and she hugged me, decision dangling. Liam strummed a victory riff, and we danced, silly and free, the room a warm shield against the cold. Mom and Dad came in February, a planned trip this time. They'd settled in Lethbridge, their little house cozy with a porch swing. We took them to the live podcast, taping me on stage, mic blazing. talking housing with Rosa beside me. They sat in the crowd, Dad's nod solid, Mom's eyes wet. After, we ate at a diner, their questions about my work real, not forced. "You're changing things," Dad said, voice low. "Didn't see that coming." I smiled, softer now. "Me neither." They left with a promise Easter in Lethbridge, and I waved, the gulf between us narrowing. Spring launched the book Homes We Lose in April, a packed signing at the Gastown shop. Grandpa flew out, cane in hand, Sophie and Jen beside him. Priya emceed, Liam sold copies, and Rosa hugged me, her grin wide. The line snaked out the door, readers clutching my words, and I signed until my wrist screamed. A critic called it urgent, human, and sales spiked, the publisher hinting at a third. We celebrated on the seawall, fish and chips in hand, Sophie snapping us against the dusk. "You're my hero," she whispered, and I held her close, the sweetness of it piercing deep. Summer flared, and Liam's tour looped back, BC now, me along for half. Priya took the Halifax postdoc, a tear-streaked goodbye at the airport, her vow to visit ironclad. "You're my anchor," she said, echoing Liam, and I cried, waving as she boarded. We drove to Tofino after, just us, camping where we'd wed. Sophie joined for a night, her camera clicking, and we swam, the ocean cold and wild. I wrote by the fire, a new story brewing not for print. Just mine and Liam played, chords soft. Grandpa called midweek, voice bright. "Painted you a wave," he said. "It's on the way." Fall found me 26, the podcast a cornerstone, my column cutting deeper. A third book loomed, Claire's brainchild, on youth and cities, and I started, slow but sure. Liam's studio thrived, kids cutting demos, his EP a quiet hit. Priya sent Halifax dispatches, snow, seals, a lab she adored, and Sophie mailed photos, her talent blooming. Mom and Dad hosted Easter, a small feast, and we talked late, their pride plain. I stood in Vancouver that winter, rain drumming the walk-up, Liam beside me, and felt it roots sunk deep, wings stretched wide. A life I'd written into being, still unfolding, page by page.